Welcome to the Green Ring, and thanks for watching. This video is third in a series of 8, presenting a note-by-note analysis of Wagner's Das Rheingold, Scene 2. Built on nearly 2 centuries of scholarly literature, its massive journey aspires to scan the entirety of Der Ring des Nibelungen to its final note. I hope you'll take this voyage with me, one I'm dedicated to completing. For an explanation of who I am, and more on the reasons for this series, please check out my preface video. Its link is supplied below, along with those for the other videos preceding this one. We pick up where we left off in Dover's full score, the first stave on page 99, as the giants enter. The Meister turns this scene with the giants and their bargain into something quite different from the mythology, yet with marked similarities. The Edda portrays the many burgs of Asgard, including Valhall, aka Valhalla, as already built, when a mason offers to erect a wall around them, promising his fortifications will be proof against invading giants. As a wage, he asks Freyja, the sun and the moon. On Loki's advice, the gods agree, but reluctantly, and with the stipulation that, if the wall isn't finished in 3 years, the mason forfeits his pay. The immortals gamble it's an impossible task, but don't count on the mason's remarkable horse, which hauls material at preternatural speeds. The wall is nearly complete when the 3rd year threatens. Gods are desperate, Loki's stock is at 0. Then, as if out of nowhere, a buxom mare prances out of the forest. The mason's steed kicks over the traces to follow her, all work forgotten. The 3-year deadline is up. The wall remains unfinished, the mason forfeits his pay, and on discovering he's a giant in disguise, the gods kill him. In time, Loki, who changed himself into the comely mare, gives birth to Sleipnir, the 8-legged war stallion who becomes Odin's preferred mount when he sallies forth into battle at the head of his Valkyries, and Loki is redeemed. This off-color tale didn't suit the Meister, yet, in his unique way, he subsumes every one of its elements into his own version. Giants contract to build for the gods, Loki is their intermediary, the gods evade payment, and a giant dies. These are obvious in Rheingold, and traditional interpretation need give them no further thought. How Wagner integrates the myth's bizarre sexual angle isn't so clear, never mind the fire god's part in it. Neither Edda specifies why its mason wants Freyja, except to ruin the gods, underlined by his additional demand for sun and moon, meaning the world's source of light. Loki's weird shape-shifted interbreeding with the mason's stallion, source of Odin's battle steed, is an obvious symbol for the gods deriving their power from giants through sexual congress. Beginning with Rheingold Scene 2, this blatant racial notion does subtly work its way into the tetralogy, where Wagner's giants ask for the love goddess alone, but with quite different and characteristic reasons for wanting her, both of which draw their concepts from the mythic tale. Fasolt and Fafnir enter to the first complete appearance of their characteristic morpheme, developed across 4 additional measures with a pair of low-ash intervals on reverse chord notes, a 3rd low-ash interval leading to a pair of extended melody note strophes separated by a falling 3rd, a reverse ash interval on an air to 4th, then 2 more low intervals, both on reverse chord notes, the first in minor mode, the second major. Massed strings, doubled by timpani and contrabass tuba, produce the forward-moving elements of the morpheme's upper staff, while in its lower, heavy brass punctuate with its regular long-short-long rhythms, not surprisingly dominated entirely by the most primal elements of Erda syntax. The passage ends, however, on a spear-like quaver figure that slows to low-string crotchets beneath Fasolt's voice as he steps before the god to act as their spokesman. Wotan brandishes his weapon, and Fasolt's vocal descends first on the Welterb triad while moving through a reverse ash interval as he points out rather cattily the gods have slept while the giants did their work. Then, as the spear reverses its motion on contrabass, trombone, bassoons, first in semibreves, then minims, he passes through static notes, leaps up an air de fourth into an inverted dash interval, which falls another fourth, then rises on the same pitch through a low ash interval, all of it befitting his status as a primal force of nature, subservient yet still powerful against Wotan's might. The giant morpheme returns, and Fasold's voice exactly sketches its melody. Then, extending it another 2 measures, voice and accompaniment intone a pair of low intervals on reverse chord notes in the giant rhythm, to finish with a last strophe concluded by a crib on the turn cell, resolving itself into 2 extended melody note strophes. With this vocal, Fasold describes their successful labors in detail. While it might be argued, based on opera and drama, all this makes the giant morpheme a subsidiary Valhalla module, I hold it conversely identifies the castle as a physical reflection of the giants themselves, an idea hand in hand with the world ash as source of power for both titans and fortress. Fasold's words also bring up a point the Meister himself never addressed, which allegorists gladly dismiss as irrelevant and stage productions ignore, even though it strikes at the tale's core believability. Knowing how the fortress is built seems essential to understanding its future fate, whether the gods design it and the giants merely execute the immortals' plans, or whether it's a joint venture, or even solely the giants' work. At the very least, having built this vast edifice stone by stone, they're privy to its defenses. Once Fafnir owns the ring, this question is vital to grasping the threat he poses the gods, and dismissing the giant as too stupid or lazy to exploit his advantage is at best a weak explanation. However, this is a problem whose solution must await more thorough production approaches. In all events, Fasold points to the fortress, and the tuba choir intones Valhalla Part 1, concatenated with the Valhalla Part 3 truncation, including 2 chord note pulses, finished by its high ash interval on its more usual third. Low strings double Fasold's next falling triad, effectively an a cappella vocal launch of Valhalla Part 1, which he concludes on a low ash interval, bouncing up then down air de fourths as the tubas complete Valhalla Part 1 with Part 3's ash interval, again on a third. Low strings doubling him at a parallax, he ceremoniously intones the final heroic melody notes in retrograde on a reverse ash interval, its falling air de fourth completed with a rising scale of extended melody notes, making it a pulse of a module that's just informed Fricka's scolding and Freya's distress. The trombone choir replies, this time with the Valhalla Part 1 distortion, not unlike Fricka's outrage at her consort, which moves through a rising triad, crowned by a pair of high ash intervals, the first on a third, the second an air de fourth, in a first inversion, simulation of the air de melody note's heroic finish. Over a cadence built from 2 non-syntactic brass chords followed by 2 in strings, Fasold intones his demand for payment with a reverse interval on an air de fourth, then, after a crotchet rest and a third above, isolates uns with the following quaver rest. He resumes, having sunk an ominous fifth, to leap up a fourth into a last descending fifth, thus launching a valedictory orchestral pulse of the giant morpheme, this one being 4 repetitions of its initial thump alone, capped with a last tonic dominant bounce. Brasses fall silent as strings alone come to rest on an unexpected yet clement major 7th semibreve chord, launches Wotan disingenuously, asking them to name their wage, isolating nent with a quaver rest, followed by a coy little reverse melody chord note turn in his voice, hinting at that turn in the giant morpheme, a kind of jeer at their interracial presumption. After a quaver rest, and launched by soft air chords in the strings, he lifts on reverse air chord notes, then a third, and, after yet another quaver rest, finishes with the heroic module, here rising a bland third as punctuated by a string quaver chord. The spear answers on low strings, a touch of loud outrage at first that quiets as it marches down under Fassel, wondering at the god's poor memory. His static vocal notes move into a reverse ash interval on a now threatening descending fifth, to rise a fourth and fall a poignant sixth. After a quaver rest, his anger increases as he repeats a full ash interval on a third, descends on chord notes, and finishes bravely with the heroic rising fifth. Fassel now shifts to the meat of his claim, which is a tender development of Freya syntax exclusively on strings, 2 strophes of its rising module on cellos, continued by a single pulse of its falling cell, capped in that chord melody note turn coined during the goddess's distress, its resemblance here to the giant turn still more poignant. Fassel's vocal, the first expression of genuine compassion in Rheingold, names the love goddess in the fondest terms on a falling triad whose heart is a static ash interval. Then, after a minim rest, dips and rises on erda fourths to conclude this initial phrase with chord notes, its core the heroic erda melody notes. Given she's a helpless pawn, calling Freya may not jibe with the actual case, but it speaks volumes of how Fassel thinks of her. After his vocal sigh on reverse melody notes with their growing sense of racial change through sexuality, 2 bold quaver string chords punctuate his resolve to have the goddess, sung to a pathetic echo of Albrecht's similar desire for the Rhine maidens, along with an ironic one of Fricka's outrage against this very bargain. Though Wotan's just wrangled at length with his consort over this very point, he promptly reneges on the agreement by feigning the giant's demand comes as a total surprise. A harsh string 7th quaver chord triggers his largely a cappella vocal by reversing erda's heroic final notes in defiance of the giant, who's only just voiced their original form, going on through a static ash interval to outline chagrin, punctuated with staccato erda chords in the strings. Parenthetically, his phrase, nub of his cunning attempt to sidestep their bargain, includes that concatenation of Albrecht's resistance and chagrin, soon to become a hallmark of his mentor Loge's vocal syntax. He orders Fassel to name another wage on a low ash interval and reverse chord notes, then staccato string quaver chords marching down reverse melody notes. The god follows them at a parallax and shapes them as a reverse ash interval by moving into a triplet which falls on a fifth, then rising from it on reverse chord notes. He harshly outlines a distortion of Freya's descending cell, telling the giant she isn't for sale. The shock of it strikes Fassel momentarily dumb as a strident octavo pedal on all 4 horns, punched by a trombone quaver, supports octavo strings racing down a semi-quaver scale ended on a quaver. It's followed by a dramatic touch which, if seemingly obvious, is anything but. This brief touch portrays the giant's outraged shock. The strings' unnatural sign, an inflation of their characteristic turn, is brutally interrupted at its low point by a quaver rest. The answering line barks a spear pulse, fractured by loud octavo trumpet syncopations, a swifter echo of those single rude pulses which disturb Freya's morpheme when it first sounds. A flourish which develops into double pulses on violins, violas, immediately before the giants enter. The double impact effect, identical pitches twice repeated in close succession, is another syntactic feature which moves subtly throughout the epic, a signal both of outrage and the frustration of some crucial goal, in this case Fassel's legitimate claim to the love goddess. As a side note, it's also the first definitive statement of the spear. With apologies to Volkswagen, the giant's indignation is a prime instance of the huge injustice done to the spear morpheme by reading it as no more than symbolic of this particular treaty. Wotan's violation of his word goes far beyond any specific contract, but is rather an effective negation of the god's power as wielded through his spear. A thesis Fasolt proceeds to develop, one that informs the entire Scene 2 conflict between giants and gods. The syntax's organization in this specific case, an unnatural falling-rising sign corrected by a falling line, spreads a message of power violated throughout the tetralogy, especially in its final chapters, clarifying passages which have long baffled analysts. Once Fasolt regains his voice, 3 dense crotchet string chords punctuate the first of as many measures, during which he expresses a cappella his outrage over this treachery, a complaint he launches with a powerful falling octave contradicted after a crotchet rest by leaping back up the same interval. After a quaver rest, he falls a tritone, then intones an echoing pair of low ash intervals, the first rising a heroic fifth, the second a poignant minor sixth. Under pulsing brass quavers, low strings rush up a semiquaver scale complicated midway by chromatics, to be capped by an upward-leaping violin-viola major mode arpeggio in staccato semiquaver triplets beneath the first held note of a mighty horn-bassoon iteration of the spear. Fasolt triggers this spear pulse with another low ash interval on an air de fourth to descend in a magisterial Welterb triad, its first 2 notes minims, then continuing on a spear-opposing line, outlining air to melody notes as he asks if that weapon's contract runes are merely a game to the immortal. He lingers on the final melody note in a static ash interval, leaded to another low interval on a third, ending with the word runen sung accusatively to another plunging octave. Only now does Fafnir chime in to sneer at his brother's credulity for not having anticipated the god's treachery. His vocal, launched by a static ash interval, outlines a slow version of Loge syntax, doubled by violas in its opposing shape, as beneath him octavo low string minims ooze down chromatically. This starkly austere passage mixes Fafnir's cynicism with his own delusion at the fire god's hands, one for which Newman reproduces in a musical example in order to mount his objections to it, which this analysis progressively rebuts as Loge's syntax develops, whose Betrug Fafnir notes. His grumble ends after his low ash interval on a tritone with a subtle touch, as a bass clarinet seems to begin on resignation, only to embellish it with a trill whose appoggiatura rises, thus producing yet another elusive pulse of the giant turn. The syntax in this heady yet veiled mix of thwarted sexuality and racial imperative is yet another echo continually sown throughout the tale. It inspires Fasolt to his noblest Rheingold outburst, an arietta whose syntactic repercussions again bear fecund dividends only as the epic reaches its conclusion. His ceremonial multi-part invocation to Wotan begins over more quaver horn pulses, his voice falling in air de fourth, followed by a little viola uprush on demi-semi-quavers, possibly the god's stung reaction to being called, rather ironically, Lichzon, after a static ash interval to plunge on a fifth. Low-string demi-semi-quavers surge up to octavo tubas in minims and a semi-brevi doubling Fasolt's vocal, a low interval rising on a third, leaded to a reverse on a melancholy sixth. The bundle echoes lowered a second, its reverse interval this time a plunging seventh, mark of Erda's inspiration, a magisterial announcement launching the giant's oration, which begins in earnest by introducing key new syntax. The quaver horn bassoon pulse defines the morpheme, together with its descending spear on low strings, a blend which characterizes the syntactic bundle as it repeats and develops. Yet at this early juncture, the giant's vocal provides its most eloquent information. Fasolt begins with a full ash interval, whose rising pitch is a heroic fifth, sign of his absolute sincerity, never mind the brave justice of his complaint, and a pointed jab at the tragic descending fifth on which he's just dubbed Wotan Lichtsohn. He continues to a rising six-note spear-opposing scale, ended with an accusatory falling octave, the combination of vocal and answering spear creating an eerie foreshadowing of Erde Twilight. This compound phrase, its second pulse, launched by reverse Erde chord notes, precisely echoes the first's spear opposition, though raised a major second, although its ash interval takes a more poignant ascending sixth. It's of note the giant's rising scale forms are each built on a pair of distinct long-short-long rhythmic pulses that may be interpreted as double Erde melody note strophes. They're also 6 notes in length, their seemingly chance opposition to the godly prerogative, yet another detail to acquire unexpected significance as the tetralogy develops, one already hinted at by the ring variant during Wotan's dream of his impregnable fortress. It's yet another strong hint the immortal's power derives from and may be taken away by Erde. Parenthetically, though he makes no mention of it in his analysis, this syntactic group is one which likely moved Voltsogen to mislabel the spear as treaty, though Fasolt's lyric makes it clear his focus is on Wotan's hegemony, the ultimate source of which is the world-ash power his spear controls. In that light, it's no surprise Fasolt's initial vocal phrase is capped in an echo of chagrin, while its plunging octave reverberates with that to which the giant points out the runes, giving Wotan's spirit's authority. Second violins, violas take over the horn woodwind pulses, and Fasolt continues, again begun by reverse chord notes, to move into a melody note opposition, which creates a ghost of the giant turn, his interracial prerogative, concluded by a plunging fifth to give it a sense of chagrin. He doubles down on this impression. The string pulses become minim pedal chords by elongating in his next lyric to finish it on another censorious falling octave. Then, in his next breath, a reverse ash interval, whose falling interval is the ominous downward fifth. The trill appoggiatura this vocal inspires, its sense of sexual frustration, subdued but unmistakable, initiates the ultimate thesis of Fasolt's argument, another passage dense with syntactic and conceptual implications for the overall drama. It's this passage which introduces the authentic treaty morpheme. Koch's argument distinguishes this syntax from the spear, finally banishing another long-standing confusion bequeathed by Voltsogen, who differentiates the morpheme from the spear but calls it a special treaty mit the giants. To justify his belief, the spear signifies treaties in general. Kobe and Newman take him at his word, but Hutchison is first to make a clear distinction between the two. Holman also grasps the difference, as does Lee, though Sabor persists in the old confusion by dubbing the spear treaty and this module troth, which, if he were really bent on eliminating the confusion, seems like a reversal of the words in question. As a last thought on the matter, there's only one genuine treaty in the ring, and that's Wotan's deal with the giants. Its other pacts appear to confuse analysts on this point, meaning Wotan forbidding violence here in Rheingold, his Valkyr oath to Fricka, then conjuring Loge as that chapter ends, his Siegfried riddle game with Mima, and the Götterdämmerung blood brotherhood oath. None of those later cases are treaties in the sense of this contract with the giants, while the spear's deployment in those instances leaves no doubt its morpheme signifies not the letter of the individual bargain's law, but the power enforcing such exchanges. Meanwhile, the spear occurs in a host of other situations unrelated to anything that might be construed as a bargain. Fasolt prepares the treaty morpheme vocally by twice singing a rising major arpeggio, each time echoed by strings in that telltale double impact rhythm, horn bassoon minim plus crotchet pedal chords supporting. This incessant repetition of a pure tonic line, never mind one closely associated with fundamental creatures of nature, identifies the syntax with a family of basic nature morphemes. Each of Fasold's introductory vocal arpeggios conclude with reverse ash intervals on chord notes, capped in falling intervals, the first in air to fourth as he indicts the god's wisdom, the second a falling octave as he promises rebellion, echoing his 3 previous downward octaves on the keywords Runen, Verträge, and Freie. The heart of his indictment is a rising-falling sign that introduces the treaty morpheme itself, ended by yet another reverse ash interval on chord notes, echoed canonically in low strings, though without the ash interval. The giant's vocal concludes with chord and melody notes that leap up a third into a version of Freia's syntax, specifically that portion which in time yields one of the work's crucial love morphemes. Fasold's version is unique in its lingering stress on the morpheme's chord notes, which, together with the separating crotchet rest, also emphasizes the reverse chord notes concluding it. During this, low strings reverse the extended version of the melody notes to counter the spear, while echoing Fasold's vocal. It should be noted the Meister's adaptation of the giant-god conflict is the virtual opposite of what it is in the myths. There, the giants are a stupid crew, bereft of eloquence, much less honor, implacable enemies of the Aesir-Vanir gods. Their contract to build Asgard's walls is a trick to defraud their enemies. In stark contrast, Fasold's Arietta implies his race willingly acquiesces to divine rule, living in honorable peace with the immortals. It's Wotan's breach of their contract that is the duplicitous outrage. Fasold implies this default would end the god's power, a betrayal sure to ignite such rage in the giants who hold the moral high ground, they'd become his implacable foes. Outside perhaps Freya, after all, Fasold is the one honorable and upright character in Rheingold, never mind its most sympathetic. Lacking only the Welsung twins, Sigmund and Sieglinde, the giant holds that distinction throughout the epic. Unfortunately, this opens another believability hole unstopped by the narrative as it stands. Powerful as Fasold and Fafnir might be, they're only 2. They might trouble the gods, but are unlikely to bring them down, making his threats hollow. As with other such wrinkles, only future productions can iron out this one. On the word Troy, Fasold sings the aria's coda announced by another rising arpeggio, this one fraught with hectic staccato viola semiquavers, tracing a rising pair of unnatural down-up sine waves. The giant's final words stress the situation's overall irony. Ein dummer Riese rät dir das, du Weiser, wiss es von ihm. Punctuated by string crotchet chords, his vocal intones a low ash interval on a third, then falls in air to fourth, to rise on the same interval, fall a third, then, after a minim rest, conclude on a plunging fifth, fourth, and third, separated for emphasis by ever briefer rests. This deceptively terse vocal, with its rare full cadence, conceals 2 developing syntactic cells with heroic import in its 2 air-to-fourth bounces, while also including the tragic descending fifth. Low strings and horns bassoons decisively close his case with a single-breast canonic echo of the treaty. Wotan has ignored his wife's hope for a peaceful, mutually satisfying home, shrugged off his infidelities, confidently justified excluding from negotiations the parties most threatened by their outcome, while putting his trust in an unreliable counselor, then brushes aside Fricka's legitimate concerns for her sister, only to at last renege on his bargain. This god has much to learn from his supposedly dull-witted employee, but foolishly has no interest. Punctuated with 2 quaver string chords, he laughs off Fasold's appeal, his vocal falling a winsome sixth into a low ash interval on a third as he sings, Wie schlau für Ernst. followed by a reverse interval on air to chord notes, and after a static triplet, bouncing up and down harsh tritones into a static interval, which he caps with a rising air to fourth as he completes the thought, Was wir zum Scherz nun beschlossen. This inspires the second violin finger tremolo, over which first violins cry the heroic syntax-generating melody notes in first inversion, an echo of Fasold's rebuke. It's a sort of godly shiver, prefacing his demand to know what they want with the goddess, his vocal bouncing up and down fourths followed by chord notes, another descending fourth, then a sixth, rising into a pair of chord notes, a ghost of Albrecht's lust, its implications of interracial breeding complicated by the nymph's taunting in Wotan's line, as he brands the giant's Töpel. This apparently simple vocal syntactic riches define Freya as a fundament of nature with multiple air to fourths, chord notes, and Rhine maiden bounce, its sexual racial charge through Albrecht's module and reverse melody notes, then finally the god's sense of his just claim to the goddess thanks to his rising fifths. Low octavo strings fall on chord notes into a twitch resembling Fasold's initial shock, and to a pair of sforzando string semibreves he rightly bridles. Hörnst du uns? Ha, wie Unrecht! His echoing phrases, a reverse ash interval on a descending sixth, then a static interval capped with a falling seventh. Erda's inspiration thus launches another arietta as he mitigates his severity with a rise and fall on air to fourths, a detail that eventually identifies him with Sigmund. He further softens by rising a third, his brief tender reference to the immortals who, durch Schönheit herrscht, floats over Freya's initial module, ascending through first violas to echo on cellos. After a minim rest, and prepared by a rising fourth, their truncated giant turn caps his phrase with an aura of sensual longing, one his vocal echoes more completely. From it, cellos slide down on a sinuous anti-natural falling rising sine wave at its bottom, meaning another giant turn, which nudges the mood back into seriousness as he continues. Gentle horns take the giant thump, joined on the next measure by a double Valhalla Part 1 pulse rising through the woodwinds, a subtle echo of Fricka's chiding. Fasold's vocal, begun on chord notes, continues through 3 consecutive ash intervals, treading a path between Valhalla Part 1 and the World Ash vocal, as he rebukes the god's lust for a heap of rocks. Pursuing that thought through a pair of falling thirds and ascending air to fourths, whose pitches, doubled in string pizzicati, rise with the horned woodwind giant thump. This falling rising module extends an extra string pulse into the giant's next phrase, its shape an eerie distortion of Albrecht's Scene 1 lust, as echoed by Wotan in admiring Valhalla. Fasold's continued scold that they'd ransom Weibeswohner for such dross sounds a ghost of renunciation, doubled in horns woodwinds, to be capped by a mournful version of the Rhine Maiden's frolic, complete with its falling triad, its hint of racial aspirations throwing the god's sneer back at him. Braced by an abrupt rising scale, violas, cellos join a peremptory horn woodwind minim chord, followed by giant pulses on strings, while horns and woodwinds insistently thump their long-short-long bass. Atop these, Fasold reminds of his and his brother's labors, voice descending a fifth into static notes and a static ash interval, after which he twice descends on thirds to rise with the harmony on air to fourths, an echo of his immediately previous vocal, both of which incidentally conclude on falling rising 3-note modules similar to Albrecht's Scene 1 Fury and Wotan's Exultation in Valhalla, a chance detail slowly acquiring syntactic weight as intense desire for a thing. two giant strophes quiet during a measure preparing Fasold's heartfelt rationale for such bitter toil, the second instance of genuine human sympathy in Rheingold, one of its few, again given to Fasold and quite unlike Albrecht's lust, the Rhine maiden's oily seductions, Wotan's affection for his own power, Fricka's sentimentality, or even Freya's pathetic distress. As such, the Meister deploys his resources to invest it with glowing tenderness. Giant thumps quiet on horns as low strings rise in Freya's initial module, echoed by a poignant oboe which completes the morpheme with a single pulse of its second half. This definitively complete iteration of the syntax inarguably refers to love alone. It's also one of the rare instances of its descending module vocalized in its undistorted definitive form, which, lacking one notable exception, won't happen again until Sieglinde sings of her love for Siegmund. In the present case, Fasold's vocal begins on a rising air to fourth to invert the giant's treaty arpeggio, thus include the falling triad with its connotations of race. Then, after a crotchet rest and launched by a poignant sixth, he doubles the oboes Freya Part 2. Its central falling interval, a fifth, is of special note, one pervading the remainder of Fasold's line, as it alternates in a kind of sing-song with rising air to fourths, a melody which implicitly several times repeats Freya's. His infatuation for the love goddess is, of course, foredoomed, since Erda's plan requires that he lose her in exchange for the hoard. Yet it's a heroic fantasy, eloquent of the passions over which Freya presides, an empathetic affection shown the love goddess by no one else, but only this one member of an entirely different race, another signal for what's to come throughout the tetralogy. Fasold's chain of descending vocal fifths and rising air to fourths terminates on air to chord notes, which linger, much as they do in his treaty vocal, such that they can't be missed. The line's harmonically syncing accompaniment on strings buoys the oboe line, itself a series of two reversed melody notes, which also twice truncate the giant turn, concluded by expanding the reversed melody into four notes, another deep-buried mystery of the ring to be prized out in time, but all having to do with this first threat which empathetic love poses to Wotan's agenda. Beneath the passage as a whole, spear-like low strings sink as they support the Freya syntax until violins, violas, harmonized at a third, take over the module. The lovelorn giant finishes his vocal after a roomy semi-breve rest, the word "und" on a crotchet followed by a quaver rest to stress his indignation. He surges from it on reverse chord notes, which become a rising arpeggio resembling his treaty module, finished by chord notes, voicing his outrage at the god's bad faith. The passage concludes, minus vocal, as Freya's initial cell rises on massed violins to intone a grace in a backward turn not unlike the giant syntax, though obviously much swifter, itself supported by an ascending viola arpeggio. Like the recent Freya vocalizations, this unique turn repeats only with Valkyr's Act 1 love music. Violins cap it with chord notes to leap up a fifth and fall on a sweet arpeggio, its first half an echoing melody note reversal, its last a treaty reversal, embellished by a viola string appoggiatura to end Fasold's love hymn on a note of poignant, sensual longing, combined with an implication the only way to forestall the giant's enmity is by yielding Freya as their prize. Few commentators mention what seems a given about Rheingold, whose entire action is a kind of learning experience for Wotan. He seems ignorant of Freya's true value, and Fasold's Arietta is, or ought to be, an object lesson for him. Taken whole, it also bruits an issue about which analysts remain universally silent, yet which is crucial to grappling the tetralogy's dramatic credibility. Fasold goes to some length contrasting their labors, which by any standard are titanic, with what motivates them to work, meaning Freya. It's all very well and good to see her as a symbol of love, but the hard truth is Fassel describes her as Weib, and it's obvious he doesn't mean some pretty wench to cook meals and tidy the house. The implication is inescapable. The giant longs for her sexually. This spectre of interracial breeding is no stranger to the mythology, in which giants and gods often share beds, sometimes even with dwarves. The mythic deities, after all, are simply another breed of giant. The implications of this for Wagner's retelling are routinely ignored by mainstream analysts. This commentary faces them head-on, but development of this knotty issue must wait until it moves closer to the tale's forefront. Of course, this tutorial in empathy is lost on Fafner as well, who dismisses Fassel's eloquence as faules Schwatzen, atop quaver string thumps, leaven with cello twitches that reverse the affectionate violin turn. Mooting his own reason for wanting the love goddess, his surprisingly melodic vocal begins with a pair of roughly echoing phrases. From static notes, he rises on syncopated reverse chord notes to fall a third into static notes, and after a dotted quaver rest, rise that same third to yield a little turn similar to Albrecht's, though with its third descending. After a crotchet rest, he goes on, doubled by viola-cello quaver punctuations, to launch extended reverse melody notes, with the reverse ash interval finished with a downward third. The string doubling becomes minim chords as he pursues his line through extended melody notes, which become a low ash interval on reverse chord notes. Then it leads to a pulse of Flosshilde's heroic module, capped by a falling octave on the words Sie zu entreißen. Paradoxically, his line includes an expanded version of the giant turn, even though his interest in the goddess isn't sexual, but to rob the gods of her apples of eternal youth, his own twisted kind of bravery, never mind sexuality, whose benefits he details with one of the epic's most recognizable morphemes. Though short-lived, it nonetheless makes an impression on all analysts. Precisely echoed in voice and horns, this syntax represents the power to bestow eternal life, yet, paradoxically, it's an unnatural downward-upward sign. This seems a contradiction until one considers its shape also echoes that of the Rhine Maiden's Lullaby, The Ring, and Valhalla Part 1. It also closely resembles the World Ash vocal, a morpheme which specifically describes the great tree after it's been destroyed. Freya and her apples, of course, are part of the dowry Wotan seizes in killing the tree in order to build his empire, closely paralleling the one of which Albrecht dreams. The apple's morpheme is built entirely from already established syntax, reverse melody notes, a descending air to fourth, the melody's syntax-generating final notes, a turn somewhere between the Rhine Maiden's refrain and the giant's, and melody notes, all surmounted by a high ash interval on a third, very like that concluding Valhalla Part 3. Note the apple's morpheme also juxtaposes reverse melody notes with their original form, just as Wotan's earlier vocal pairs the Welterb triad with its ominous inversion. As a final clue to the apple morpheme's deeper meaning, timpani beat out a steady pulse of Valhalla ash intervals, which contrabasses answer as regularly to create a series of falling octaves not unlike those associated with Albrecht in Scene 1. Their close juxtaposition, however, also creates rising octaves, another clue to the apple's ambivalent powers. No analyst misses this inimitable morpheme, and all agree it refers to Freya's apples, though none have much to say about it, taking its meaning as self-evident, thus of minor importance to the work's overall syntax. The depth of this error emerges in its extension, where both orchestra and vocal reiterate the Welterb triad, quickly followed by melody notes. The gods depend upon the apples after all, so they may live on to spread their racial influence over the world, a point Loge soon emphasizes when he arrives with his praise of the giant's fine work on Valhalla, that home from which Donner and Fro are empowered to pursue their wooing. Fafner is aware of this, as is Fasold, hence the covert significance of these modules in his description of the apples which fuel the godly racial agenda. Another small mystery is the overall morpheme's resemblance to that variety of Biedermeier-like hunting fanfares which crop up a few times in Valkyr to characterize Siegmund's peregrinations in the wild before meeting Sieglinde. While that syntactic relevance must wait until a consideration of Valkyr, it could be the Meister associated his Freya with Diana, the Greek and later Roman goddess of the hunt, who was also patroness of fertility through pregnancy. While Porges said Wagner believed, "The passage as a whole makes a mysterious, veiled effect. It sounds twice, precisely doubled by Fafner's voice. It then develops in 2 strophes, each of them comprised of an initial cell become a falling triad, then melody notes, followed by the chord note opposition turn, its ending cell become an unsyncopated falling third. During these 2 developmental variants, Fafner's vocal distorts their initial halves by rising at a parallax on a third, into their Welterbe triads. With its second measure, he mirrors this first iteration all but exactly, adding only that grace which transforms the line into a subtle giant turn, his concluding third descent not coincidentally on the word zippen. But his vocal digresses entirely from the next iteration's second measure as he moves through the first inversion heroic melody notes, shaped as a low ash interval, to fall and air the fourth on Jungen, thus creating that nationally syntactic fourth bounce. This introduces Fafner's gloat over the immortals withering away, once robbed of the goddess's fruit. It's a crucial syntactic landmark, only vaguely grasped by analysts. Alone among commentators, Volkswagen notices this passage, going so far as to present a musical example, albeit one limited to its orchestral portion. He refers to this as a motive of a growing twilight, and even remarks on the chromaticism of its last 2 measures. But this hardly says it all. Volkswagen's focus on the orchestra is apt, however, particularly since it consists solely of low woodwinds, a touch saved in the ring for subtly ominous situations. A pair of iterations compress the apple syntax, its rather complex original, withering into a much barer approximation of the ring. The module thinking portion is almost certainly what suggests to Volkswagen the idea of twilight. Its precursor occurs several times in Scene 1 vocals to characterize the Rheingold's ambivalent energy. As such, Volkswagen's is a keen observation, pinpointing the one apple fragment which after this, its first bow, repeats both this transformation's initial descending cell and the module in its original apple's form. Even its rather unimaginative 4-square construction serves a narrative purpose, emphasizing the god's risky complacence in depending so completely on the fruit of immortality. It's also no coincidence Fafner's vocal line foreshadows one of Loge's most important modules, a character who both embodies the fire of life and serves as the god's covert betrayer. Volkswagen notes the episode's chromatic finish only in passing, yet it's as important as its first 2 measures, sinking as it does in another hint of magic sleep, with particular stress laid by bassoons in doubling that morpheme's reverse melody notes. Completing the sonic image, they're accompanied by a pair of Erde chords, strikingly like their most Erde-centric versions in Siegfried. In both its forms, that pivotal morpheme dominates the entire sequence, its chords the heart of its quasi-ring distortions, and as chord notes pervading Fafner's vocal, thus dominating the passage front to back. For added measure, Fafner's voice launches the 2 Loge-like apple distortions on plunging fifths, then continues with 2 whirl-dash intervals, a reverse and a static. This moment, after all, strikes at the divine race's heart, not just their power over the world, but the very survival of their kind. Not only must they die should the giants have their way, but Freya herself would become the mother of a new race of giant immortals. Portius, thus through him, the Meister, is at least marginally aware of the threat hidden in this syntax, one that goes beyond mere loss of the apples. There is an undercurrent of fear now in the calmness that Wotan has maintained. Fafnir ends his brief arietta on the advantages of wresting away the apples, his optimism burgeoning with a low ash interval rising in air to fourth, his words capped by a strophe of Flosshild's heroic module, formed with a confident full ash interval on a heroic rising fifth, the interval most frequently heard with the nymph's bowl module, when at last it definitively becomes its own morpheme of heroic resistance. Punctuated by two low string viola quavers, the giant triumphantly asserts they must pluck the goddess from the immortals, voice leaping up a third into an opposition of air to melody notes, the rising fifth between them creating a shadow Flosshilde pulse. His gauntlet is endorsed by a bold orchestral statement of the apples on massed horns, strings beneath them repeating the giant thump. It nails Fafnir's more atavistic idea with what is also a harshly defiant sonic picture of Freya ensconced as mother of a new immortal giant race. This worries Wotan into dithering again over Loge's tardiness, his vocal weakly striving to counter Fafnir's with an echoing low ash interval on an air to fourth, then sink on that pitch, followed by a meager rising third. Sung atop two wan bassoon chords and a timpani roll, it emphasizes the god's desperate, shivering reliance on the very natural power he's so flagrantly offended. Knowing the god's weakness, Vassal presses for their wage, bouncing down then up on air to fourths, as giant thumps sound twice on strings, this time punctuated by quaver horn chords to stress the giant's vocal fourths. Echoing his previous fluster over Loge, Wotan insists on other payment, his vocal a feeble low-ash interval, echoing Fafnir's, but only on a second, instantly contradicted by an unpromising descending fifth, sign both of his resistance and guilt. While finishing on a rising third lends him a hint of authority, his only support is two slightly more robust rising horn chords. The giants aren't having it. But that's for the next video, which picks up where this one leaves off in Dover's full score on the first stave of page 108. As always, thanks for watching, and please do leave your comments. Time and energy allowing, I'll do all I can to respond. Lastly, as all YouTubers know, your subscription to this channel by itself is a huge assist in completing this vast project. Hit the bell to be notified of the next videos. With luck and your support, there's a lot more to come.